FM, the last word with Irish Life Family Protection.
Your peace of mind today, their financial security tomorrow. Irish Life.
Our next guest is going to be a speaker at the Financial Terrorism Exposed event to be held in Dublin at near the end of the month on Sunday the 27th of May. He's going to talk about Ireland being on the brink of becoming an EU colony, although I think there are many of us who think that that's already happened. He's the author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman and also of Hoodwinked. John Perkins, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
Now, before I get to your appearance here in Ireland, I just want you to tell us a little bit about your books, Confessions of an Economic Hitman and Hoodwinked. You claim to have been an economic hitman. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's fair to say that economic hitmen has created the world's first truly global empire, and it's a corporate empire. It's not a U.S. empire. It's not a country's empire. It's really a corporate empire. We work many ways to make this happen, but perhaps the most common is that we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, or perhaps in the case of Ireland, it's a labor force. There's many things that we can look for. But then we arrange huge loans to that country from the World Bank or its sister organizations. However, the money never actually goes to the country. Instead, it goes to the multinational corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country, things like power plants and industrial parks that benefit a few wealthy families in the country, as well as the multinational corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity, can't get jobs in an industrial park because they don't hire that many people, and then the country's left holding a huge debt when it can't repay. So at some point we go back and say, hey, sell your assets off to our corporations, sell your utility companies off, sell your forests and your fisheries off to our big corporations, or sell your resources cheap, your oil or whatever the resource is, allow us to build a military base on your soil, those sorts of things. And in the few cases where we fail, where economic hitmen fail to get presidents to agree to these terms, to play this game, the jackals go in and either overthrow governments or assassinate leaders, as they recently did in Honduras with Zelaya, as we've done with Roldos in Ecuador and Allende in Chile and Lumumba and so many others.
Who are the we?
Pretty much the way we work.
When you keep saying we, who are these we?
Well, the we are the economic hitmen. I'm no longer one of them, fortunately. But when I use that term, I was saying what I did in those days. The jackals, I never did anything illegal. What I did should be illegal, what I just described. The jackals, of course, do illegal things. They overthrow governments, assassinate leaders. I was never part of that. If I failed to corrupt the leaders, then the jackals came in.
Who were you working for?
Well, I was working for a private consulting firm, Charles T. Main in Boston. It no longer exists, but at the time it was 100 years old, a very prestigious firm, very quiet, very secretive. My official title was Chief Economist. I had a staff of several dozen very expert people working for me, but my real job was a con man, to get these presidents to accept these loans.
Why did you do it?
To begin with, it was what I learned in business school. We're taught that this is the way to help countries develop. That to bring countries out of poverty, you put a lot of money into infrastructure. And in fact, statistically, you can show that it works. So when we invest a lot of money into a power system, electrical system, over time, you can see that the GDP increases as a result. So I was taught that this was the right thing to do, and I believed it for a while. But over time, and perhaps because I had been in the Peace Corps in the Amazon and Andes, I could sort of relate to the people more, and I began to see that what this system was actually doing was just making the wealthiest people at the top more and more wealthy, making the poor poorer and driving the middle class into poverty. And statistically, what we have to understand is that the statistics are driven by the very wealthy. I'm not sure what the case is in Ireland, but in the United States, 400 people in the United States have more wealth than half the rest of the country. And so right now we're showing some economic growth in the United States. That reflects these wealthy 400 people, the 1% everybody talks about. The majority of the people in the United States, as in Ireland and so much of Europe, are not benefiting. They're not getting any growth in the economy, but the statistics still can show growth.
You're giving this speech at the Financial Terrorism Exposed event on Ireland on the brink of becoming an EU colony. Sure, we're not there already. When we signed our deal with the IMF and the European Commission and the European Central Bank in November 2010, wasn't that the surrender of our economic sovereignty? done and dusted?
In a way, yes, it was. But I think you've got a referendum coming back at the end of May, and I think this gives you an opportunity to reverse that process. So the old colonies were controlled by the military, and it was really hard once the military had taken over to break free. Ireland did do it, as the United States did it. But today, colonization is more subtle. It's done on this economic front. But it also means that it's easier to break free of it, to recognize that it's controlled by big corporations. But ultimately, they count on us for support. These corporations cannot survive unless we buy their goods and services and play along with their game. And most of the politicians today are basically owned by corporations. That's true in Ireland. It's true throughout Europe. It's true in the United States. It's true throughout most of the world.
But if we vote no, how are we going to reverse what was done to us in November 2010?
Well, I think one of the things is that you don't pay off the debts that you're told that you're owed by the IMF and the European Central Bank, et cetera. Which I guess the European Bank is run by a former official, a high officer in Goldman Sachs, and that's pretty typical. These guys are looking out for their interest, not the people's interest. Countries like Iceland and Ecuador and Argentina and Brazil over time have refused to pay off these debts because they say they don't really owe them. The people did not agree to these debts for the most part. And I think that's a very strong position to take and an important one to take. And I think if Ireland combines with some of the other countries, Italy and Greece and Portugal and Iceland and some of the countries in Africa and Latin America and Asia, these form alliances and just say, hey, the banks need to cover their own debts. They coerced our leaders into taking these things. Our leaders did well, but we the people didn't, and we're not going to pay back.
There would be enormous sympathy in this country for the idea of not paying bank debts, private banks, which were then effectively nationalised by taking on their debts. But even if you were to do that and say we're not repaying those bank debts, we still have national debts, state debts that have to be paid. And even today, for the first 4 months of the year, it was revealed that the state spent $7 billion more than it took in tax revenue. Money has had to borrow from the IMF and the European Commission and the European Central Bank. Now, if we renege on our repayments of debts to those sources, where are we going to get the money to close the gap between what the government spends on employing all of the public servants, providing all the various services around the country, the gap between what it spends and what it takes in?
Well, I think for one thing, you tax the ones who benefited from all of this. You tax the big corporations that are operating in Ireland, the multinationals that are working very successfully in Ireland.
But if they decide to leave, what if all the major multinationals who are taxed at 12.5% decide, well, we're being taxed too much in Ireland, so we'll just up sticks and we'll move to continental Europe or further afield, and then we don't have them to pay any taxes and we don't have them to give us the jobs that they have?
That's why it's important to form alliances with some of the other countries that are in a similar situation, not just in Europe, but around the world, because ultimately these corporations can't afford to leave all of these places, and being taxed less than 15% is not a very high tax for them to pay. I don't think they'll leave because of that, and they certainly can't afford to leave if other countries join in this. I think it's really important for the Irish people to get together and work with people that are in similar positions throughout the world. This is a global problem. The world economy is falling apart. We've created a failed economy around the globe because of these big corporations. This is truly a failed economy, and it's not going to recover. One example of the failure is that less than 5% of the world's people, the people in the United States, consume more than 30% of the world's resources, while half the world's starving or on the verge of starvation, and the countries of Europe are going bankrupt. That's a failed system. It can't be replicated. Africa, Asia, Latin America, China, India, Europe cannot do what the United States has done. The numbers simply don't add up. So we have to change the system, and it's not going to be easy. And it's going to take some discipline.
And it's not going to be easy, and it would take time. And even if you were to form alliances with countries like you mentioned, such as Iceland and others, there still would be an enormous amount of countries, particularly those in the European Union, who wouldn't form an alliance with us, who could get all of those multinational companies going there and getting the jobs. So if that was to actually happen, then what would we do to make up the difference between what we spend, our government spends, and what it takes in?
Well, I think you're making a lot of suppositions there. I don't think these companies cannot afford to leave.
Can we afford to take the chance?
What's your alternative?
I'm not saying, I'm just asking you. I'm asking you about the theories that you're putting forward. I'm asking you how likely they are to actually succeed. Because one of the things in this EU fiscal treaty is, which has been described as a way of enforcing austerity, it's actually forcing countries to borrow less from the Goldman Sachs and the various other banks of this world, to be less dependent upon them.
Yes, and that's a very, very good policy. So you don't have to reject all of the conditions in the referendum at all. I mean, you can institute sane policies, and you should. There should be a lot less borrowing on that kind of level. But the average... But
that's what the referendum is asking us to endorse. That's the key element to this EU Fiscal Compact Treaty, that in future states borrow less money, and the money that they're not borrowing from the Goldman Sachs and all the rest of it. I mean, the irony is that people who are arguing no, particularly people on the left, are arguing for the opportunity to borrow more money from the likes of Goldman Sachs.
No, that's not how I hear it, and perhaps I'm not in Ireland at this point, so perhaps I'm missing some of this. But what I'm understanding is that there's also a lot of clauses in there about asset stripping, about selling off your fisheries and your forestry businesses and your utilities to big corporations, to multinational corporations, and to getting the average Irish person to suffer from this austerity more than the big banks do, more than the big businesses do. I think reducing debt is an excellent idea. But asset stripping is a terrible idea, and putting the burden on the average Irish person or Italian or Greek or whoever is a terrible idea, because basically these people are not the ones that cause the problem.
Thank you very much for joining us. John Perkins is author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman and also the book Hoodwinked. He is coming to the Financial Terrorism Exposed conference at the Slorgan Park Hotel on the 27th of May, Sunday the 27th of May, and he'll be speaking on Ireland on the brink of becoming an EU colony.